Wolfson Library for helping us set this up. My name is Dave Solzeski. I'm a local wolf advocate. During my wolf advocacy journey, which is still pretty young, actually, relative to the people you'll hear from, I've been fortunate enough to get to know some very important special people that you'll be hearing from and can talk to here after this particular presentation. I asked them to come here to speak to you folks, just to learn a little bit more about wolves, ask questions. Be sure to go check out the displays that we have here and grab the materials that are here. So I encourage you to be interactive with us and ask lots of questions. So I'll try and do my best to do an introduction here via phone. Vision is bad enough as it is, but okay, so Nancy Warren is in the back and she has all the materials. Since 1993, Nancy Warren has been committed to dispelling myths and unfounded fears associated with wolves by investigating facts and studying scientific research. Her passion began when she learned that there was a handful of wolves in Michigan's Upper Peninsula and became involved by attending workshops, conferences, and lectures. She believes that for wolves to survive, there needs to be human tolerance and strives to increase social tolerance through education. She served on the Michigan DNR Wolf Roundtable when the guiding principles for the Michigan Wolf Management Plan were developed, served on the Wolf Advisory Council for the Keep Michigan Wolves Protected campaign, and also served on the team that developed the Wolf Planning Guide for agencies and advocates. Also for 19 seasons, she was a volunteer carnivore tracker in Milas and Iron counties for the Wisconsin DNR. Since 2014, Nancy has served as the volunteer executive director for the National Wolfwatcher Coalition, a 501c3 organization whose mission is to educate and advocate for wolves. So be sure to visit with Nancy after the talk and view the cool things she has, pelts, skulls, tracks, bounty information, just a lot of great material back there. Our speaker today is Peter David. Peter David grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where he once sold hot dogs at Packer games. After obtaining a BS and master's degree in wildlife ecology from UW-Madison, he headed north to work for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, which was only in its third year of existence at the time. There, his next education began as Ojibwe elders, and individuals shared their traditional ecological knowledge and worldview on wild rice, waterfowl, wolves, and other more than human beings, which his work is focused upon. His work with wolves included sharing Ojibwe perspectives and understandings with organizations and individuals throughout the western Great Lakes region. Since his retirement in 2022, he has remained active in wolf stewardship issues, including serving on the boards for the Timber Wolf Alliance and the International Wolf Center, but is representing only himself here today. We're not working on natural resource issues you might find in writing, or off with his wife harvesting wild rice, picking wild berries, making a little maple syrup, catching a few fish, or doing just about anything else that gets him outdoors. So please welcome Peter David.
Thank you, Dave. I do like to thank the library for providing the space and hosting this event. They've been wonderfully accommodating. I'd like to thank Nancy for bringing all the fun stuff here. It's going to be a lot more interesting than me. But I'd especially like to thank Dave because he's the one who really bears the responsibility for putting this whole event together. It's greatly appreciated. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I currently live, my wife and I, who's in the audience, live in the little town of Washburn, which is the town you might not know. It's the last one you drive through before you get to Bayfield, if you ever go up that way. But it turns out I've got actually very strong family ties to Eagle. My grandparents lived here. My grandfather actually built one of the original movie theaters down on Main Street. My grandmother was a nurse and midwife here, and probably kept the family afloat during the Depression. If there's some serious old-timers who know the history, a great uncle of mine was named Prosper Stein, was sort of legendary in this part till he passed away about 50 years ago. But was a person who spent his whole life hunting, fishing, trapping, logging, fish guiding. I really had a lifestyle that was fairly close probably to the Ojibwe subsistence style in many ways. And I have to say, I grew up in Green Bay, as was noted, but summer vacations with my family often meant coming up here for a week and getting a cabin someplace on a lake somewhere. Back in the era when if the sign said fully modern housekeeping units, it meant you didn't have to use the outhouse. I preface my talks with a couple of caveats. First of all, I want to point out that there is no single Ojibwe perspective towards Manganeg or wolves. Okay, there's a variety of opinions certainly held by Ojibwe people, just as there is with non-tribal people. But I will be talking about perspectives that are generally held, and probably more importantly, they've actually been endorsed in many cases by tribal governments, and I think that's really what kind of gives credence to that perspective when I'm representing it. I usually talk mostly from the Ojibwe side of things, even though I'm not a tribal member myself. My 3 decades plus working with Wolfwatcher and having the great honor of being exposed to tribal elders in the Ojibwe worldview that was shared with me. But in this talk, I also talk a little bit more about maybe my own cultural background, European migrants. But I end up again talking in generalities, and I just want to note that I recognize that things are more complex sometimes than you can really delve into all of the details, so some of it gets a little bit glossed over. But with that in mind, I'm going to try to jump into this and give you some thoughts on achieving coexistence with wolves in the Western Great Lakes region. Today here in Wisconsin, I'd say we're really at a remarkable point in our relationship with wolves. Okay, I was born into a wolfless Wisconsin. Okay, it's pretty different today. We have about 1,000, maybe even 1,100 wolves in the state of Wisconsin. That's a population that's probably very close to its biological carrying capacity. And the same is true really for the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. That population hasn't changed in many years, and northern Minnesota, right? So we have maybe collectively in the ballpark around 4,700 wolves in this 3-state region. That's a number, when I think about that Wisconsin number, that's a number even biologists really didn't think was possible probably even a couple decades ago. So I think it's a tremendous tale about the resiliency of wolves and how much our relationship with them is really changing. I will just point out that these numbers are late winter, early spring numbers. That's sort of the standard protocol in the biological world. That's the time you count wolves. You have track data together over the winter. The population is at their lowest at that time. After the pups are born, these populations may temporarily double in size and then they start to drop off fairly quickly because mortality tends to be very high in both populations. This number for Wisconsin of about 1,000, I try to put that in some perspective some ways. This is the map from the Wisconsin DNR wolf occupancy model that gives you an idea of the best wolf habitat in the state and the areas most commonly occupied. Okay? 1,000 wolves is not too different from the population estimate for Land O'Lakes, Wisconsin. Okay? But this 1,000 wolves are spread out over about 40% of the state. Okay? If we only had 1,000 people in that same area, I think you'd consider it probably nearly uninhabited. But many people oftentimes feel that we're sort of overrun by wolves. I also like to point out, just for a sense of perspective, that in the 45 years or so that it took the wolf population to go from 0 to 1,000, the human population in Wisconsin increased by about 1.3 million. But at any rate, we do have this population that's really much higher than many biologists thought possible. And so we're at a new stage. And this recovery in wolves tends to elicit really sort of different responses in different cultural communities. I think in the non-Indian community, there's a tendency to sort of have a different relationship perhaps with wolves when they're considered recovered as opposed to being threatened or endangered under the state or under the federal Endangered Species Act. Okay? We think of them differently, we might interact with them differently. I would say that's not particularly true for most Ojibwe people. Okay? They certainly welcome wolf recovery. It may strengthen the relationship, but the essential nature of the relationship with wolves really hasn't changed. It's been very consistent when wolves were threatened and as they've come back. And I think this difference in the reaction to recovery makes you think about all the differences that exist between these two different cultures and how did they get actually to be so different. And I think these things were influenced really by practical matters and also by cultural concerns. Okay? And the two of these are oftentimes much more interwoven with each other than we give credit to. And I think that's actually especially hard to see in your own culture. It's hard to see things that you're too close to. And I think it was a huge benefit for me, actually, as a biologist, to work for the tribes and see natural resources from their worldview, because it gave me a chance also to step sort of outside of my culture and see it with a different set of eyes. Certainly, lifeways shaped these two different cultures' relationships a great deal. And the biggest difference probably, of course, was the fact that many European cultures, shepherding had a very significant role in society. And there was really a lack of that in North America amongst Native American tribes, at least prior to European contact. And I'm sure it's no surprise to anybody in the room that livestock raising cultures tend to have a little more enmity towards wolves, right? They probably experienced losses at some point, and it wouldn't be shocking to imagine that you'd think the world would be a better place without them. Certainly, religion sort of reinforces this perspective. I happen to be raised in a very Catholic family, 10 years of Catholic school. And so I was embedded repeatedly with this idea, that the Lord is my shepherd and I am one of the flock. I'm sheep, essentially, in a certain way. And it can give the idea of livestock depredations, it can make it feel kind of personal, even if it doesn't affect me directly. I think it'd be fascinating to know how much did shepherding actually influence religion and how much did religion influence shepherding? I doubt that question can be really answered. People who have gone down that philosophical rabbit hole, I think, come to sort of the idea that it's sort of a rabbit or a chicken or an egg question. They co-evolved with each other and influenced each other over very long periods of time. I do want to point out, before I look at the Ojibwe relationship with wolves a little bit, is that Europe was not devoid of coexistence examples with wolves, historically or even today. And just in the last few months, I've come across several articles out of Europe, Turkey, India, Portugal, all that highlighted sort of long-standing coexistence relationships, even in communities that had shepherding as being a really important part of the culture and the economy. And this coexistence, I think, these examples that came up, really go back to the practices and perspectives. Okay, and a great example, I stole this photo from an article in the BBC, and it was about an area in Portugal where wolves had never been eliminated. Okay, and this particular shepherd, named Miguel Alfonso, is quoted as saying that his two favorite animals are sheep and wolves. And you kind of think, is that possible? I don't think I've ever heard anybody in North America come up with that statement. So how is it? And I think it is. It goes back, again, to practices and perspectives. And so the practices included the fact that he lived with his sheep. Okay? He was part of their lives, really, especially at nighttime. And he had the practice of having guard dogs. I think for 200 dogs, he had approximately 6 guard dogs. Or for 200 sheep, he had half a dozen yard dogs. The perspective also comes from the fact that his world is really bigger than shepherding. He also had grain and, what was it, chestnut plantations. And he felt that the wolves were very beneficial to him by controlling deer and boars that had negative impacts on those interests of his own. So he was very happy to live with this coexistence with wolves. But despite these examples that existed in Europe, I think it's pretty clear, probably to everyone in the room, that those kind of stayed on the other side of the pond, and they didn't come here to Turtle Island, as it's known to the Ojibwe. And And here, the dominant perspective came that to eliminate wolves. Colonists worked relentlessly to kill wolves, and it turned out even at that time, wolves are not actually particularly hard to kill. And of course, in the lower 48 of the United States, wolves, which had one of the greatest distributions across that landscape, were eliminated from the entire range in the lower 48, except for this remnant population in northern Minnesota that hung on. The Ojibwe, in contrast, had a worldview that really valued mining or wolves. And I think, again, it included coexistence on sort of a cultural level, but also on a practical level, and that part's often overlooked. Sometimes it's sort of poo-pooed, I think, that there's this cultural stuff, you know, but it's often easily overlooked that tribal members were living on the same landscape and sharing it with wolves as well. Just as European societies, cultural practices and beliefs influenced the way the Ojibwe looked at wolves. As hunter-gatherers, you know, they had a very different relationship with the land and shepherding societies. But I still think it's a little bit surprising that wolves weren't vilified, okay? If a wolf takes a deer that I had hoped to feed my family with, you know, am I affected by that less than if they take a sheep that I was going to have slaughtered? And at the same time, today we know that many sport hunters whose need perhaps to harvest a deer is much less than it was for traditional subsistence hunters are very quick to vilify wolves. Okay, so it's interesting that from a practical standpoint, it didn't seem to drive this perspective. So it seems that this perspective came more from the cultural beliefs that they held. And part of that belief goes all the way back to the Ojibwe's creation story. And this story has some parallels to the biblical story that I was brought in with, and having sort of a sequence to it. But instead of 7 days, there are 4 orders of creation. And this will be a wholly inadequate summary of the story as it's been shared with me. But in the first order of creation, sort of the fundamental building blocks were placed, or created. So the land, the water, the air, and fire, or the sun. First order of creation. Then with that in place, as you can imagine, it made room for the second order of creation, all the plant beings. Each one put where it added the most beauty and the most function to the world. With the addition of that, we had room now and places and habitat for the third order of creation. The furred, the feathered, the scaled, all the animal beings. And then finally, in the fourth level of creation, came original man. And if original man looks very tiny here and sort of unimportant, that's because he is, okay? In this worldview, it's really understood that humans are the most dependent, should be the most humble being on the landscape, because the other orders of creation were doing fine by themselves. And the human had to come last because he was totally dependent upon all the other parts of creation for his own survival. Unfortunately, all of these other more than human beings, again, took pity upon this weak and dependent being and agreed to provide for the needs. Now, original man was given a task by the Creator to go and name all the beings that existed on it. And as he made this journey, he saw that most things came in pairs. And he was alone. And he had a loneliness of spirit about that. And he went back to talk to the Creator about it. And the Creator responded by providing not a woman, but a wolf to walk and to talk and to play with. And the Creator sent the two of them out to visit all of the earth's places together. My tongue-in-cheek description of this is the original road trip. Right? If you've ever taken a really long road trip with somebody, you know you tend to get to know them pretty well by the time it's done. And as man and Mayan traveled together, they saw all of the beauty in nature, they saw all of the interconnectedness that existed in nature. And they saw the very special relationship that existed between the two of them. And that relationship is very oftentimes described as brothers. Okay? Although many Ojibwe will also tell you that that even doesn't go far enough. That really they were more like parts of a single greater being. So, when that task was done and they went back to the Creator, they must have really been shocked, because the Creator said that now you have to go your own way. You have to take your own path. Okay? But what will happen to one of you will happen to the other. And I think if you look at the history of wolves and Native American people in North America, you can find all kinds of examples where their paths have in fact been very similar, very common fates. And I will say, if you forget everything I say today, try to remember that, because I think that's the most important thing to understand the Ojibwe worldview towards Mayangan. If you have a common fate, then obviously what you want for wolves is the same thing you want for your own communities. So, given this understanding of the world, you can imagine it's pretty easy to think that you'd have a different relationship with Mayangan and with most of the natural world than a culture that believes they have dominion over all the other beings. But the kicker is going to be, I'm going to suggest that when these two worldviews are actually looked at more closely, they lead to very similar relationships with wolves. Okay. But before I get into that a little deeper, I do want to consider one other thing. We have these two different cultural views, and I, as a scientist, I always wondered, so which one aligns better with contemporary ecological science, right? Both of these relationships developed long before the science of ecology. So which one turns out to line up sort of better? I think today, certainly we have many people who are downplaying the benefits or the truths of science. I would say if you happen to carry a phone, you're probably supportive of science more than you might recognize. But personally, I think science has a sort of an indispensable role in helping us to understand the functioning of nature. I also find that it adds beauty, okay, and an understanding and a richness that goes sort of beyond the common sheen of science. At the same time, I also believe in TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, the kind of knowledge that you gain simply by living on a landscape and observing it closely for centuries. Okay? It's really a form of science as well, okay? But it's often overlooked and undervalued. This train of thought makes me think about the 7 primary Godfather teachings of the Ojibwe and many other, actually, this is shared with many other Native American nations. These are ancient teachings about how to live a good life, which is really a life in harmony with the natural world. It might be a little hard to make these out, but there's 7 of these primary teachings, and the one that I really want to talk about today is humility. And interestingly, a wolf is usually used to embody this trait. Okay, each of these teachings in the oral tradition usually had an animal associated with them to help the young minds understand and grasp them and embed them. So, but a wolf for humility, it seems, I don't think my culture would have made that selection right there. So you might wonder how that came to be. But why might it be important to think about humility when we think about ecological science? And I think it's because the science of ecology is still a babe in the woods. Okay? The term ecology was coined less than 160 years ago. The science of the wildlife ecology is much younger than that. Many people contend that the father of this field was Elder Leopold. Leopold was hired in 1933 to create a newly created chair of game management at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The Department of Wildlife Management wasn't formed until 1939, and it it wasn't until 1967, or nearly 2 decades after Leopold died, that the department name was changed to wildlife ecology, from game management to wildlife ecology, to reflect this evolution that was taking place in the science. Okay, 1967. I want to try to put that into perspective a little bit. I'll say, on a very personal level, one of my major professors when I was a student at Madison was a student under Leopold. That's a pretty tight link. It was also mentioned in my introduction that I'm on the board with the International Wolf Center. That was founded by this gentleman, Dr. L. David Meach, okay? Person who was not the first wildlife person to study wolves, but certainly one of the first, and is today considered one of the leading authorities in North America, if not the world, okay? Dr. Meach is still very active in wolf education, very active on the International Wolf Center board, okay? So, it's kind of an amazing thing to me. I'm not belittling science at all, but Dr. Meach, the last time he talked about, he gave a great presentation about his history as a researcher. That started long before we had radio collars that could be tracked by satellites. He talked about trapping an animal and putting a tag on it, and maybe you'd see it again someday, and maybe not. Maybe somebody would trap it, maybe you'd get hit by a car, and you'd get 2 data points. Now we can follow animals around, okay? But it's fascinating to me that there's a person alive today that can take us back almost to the origin of the Western study of wolves, still living today. That's an incredibly tiny sliver of human history. One of the things Dave talked about in that thing is that one of the first things that they documented was that wolf packs were families. An incredibly basic, fundamental understanding that wasn't known to Western science at that time. And I can't prove it, but I'm willing to bet that it was probably known to many Native American tribes. Okay? The reason they talked about picking my ingot to represent humility is that they understand that the wolves' greatest purpose is filled not by taking care of itself, but by making its contribution to the pack, whatever that might be, to the family. So, I think when I go back and I return to that question about which worldview aligns best with ecological science today, though, I have to go with the Ojibwe worldview. Okay, over and over and over again these days, we are learning more and more ways that wolf lives matter, the effects that they have on the landscape, and we know so much more now than we knew 20 years ago. We're going to know so much more 20 years from now. And I really think, I think it's important to remember that 100 years from now, people are probably going to look back to the knowledge that we have today, the way I look back at medicine at the time. It was, amputations involved a saw and biting on a bullet. I will say, I think the Ojibwe, certainly cultural relationships in both Europe and again here in North America affected this worldview. But I think the Ojibwe perspective was really based on a traditional ecological knowledge. Well, the Ojibwe worldview, or the European worldview, was really based on traditional knowledge about raising livestock, okay, a human construct of this agrarian activity. And so I think that's why the Ojibwe world lines up. Again, though, I do think that when you bring these two things together under the same microscope, it actually leads you to some fairly similar perspectives. Now, despite those years in Catholic school, I guess I wasn't a very good student because I'm hardly a theologian. But if you look into the meaning of the word dominion as it's used in the Bible, actual theologians will tell you that it does not mean giving people the power to play God. to use or discard plants and animals and landscapes to fit their own needs. Dominion is a responsibility to steward all of the things that God created with intent and purpose, and to take care of them actually in the same way that God would. Okay? This is not me, again, not a theologian, but the people who do study this and understand this. Okay? To me, that sounds a great deal like an Ojibwe teaching that says we should act in a way that the best interests of the more than human beings are always kept in mind with every action that we do. So we have one worldview that places people sort of above the rest of creation, one worldview that places humans below the rest of creation, but the net result, the relationship that gets derived from either one of those is really very similar. So you might think, how does this Ojibwe worldview, how does it apply on the landscape today, sort of in contemporary wolf management? I think there were two primary perspectives that get driven by this. And the first of these has to do with population goals. This is a map, again, of Wisconsin wolf range as recently as 2020, okay? When it comes to wolf populations, the Ojibwe would tell you that wolves should be allowed to determine their own population and distribution on the landscape. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean every square foot, but their general distribution should be determined by wolves, okay? It is arrogant, the opposite of humbleness, to tell wolves where they're supposed to live. Okay, we should let wolves tell us that. The second primary principle comes to do with what we tend to call hunting, or what looks like hunting. Certainly, Ojibwe people are not anti-hunting. A great deal of my career was spent helping people harvest various species in a subsistence manner to meet the needs of their community. Okay? But what looks very much like my culture's hunting comes from a very different motivation. Okay? Instead of going out and so much taking an animal, they ask an animal to give itself up so that a legitimate need can be met. And I will say that while there might someday, in some situation, be a legitimate need to ask my Indian to give up its life, so far in the three-state region here, in years when there were wolf seasons allowed, no Ojibwe tribe offered the opportunity to take a wolf's life to its members. And those were positions that were strongly enforced by tribal elders. Now, again, there is a range of opinion. There are tribal members, I'm sure, who take that opportunity if there is given to them. But the predominant position amongst the tribal elders and the tribal governments is to oppose the recreational harvest of wolves. Does that mean there's never a reason to take a wolf's life? No. Our Cliffwicks member tribes, when I worked there, recognized that in rare human safety concerns, there were probably justification in some livestock depredation controls when non-lethal methods weren't deemed feasible or effective. They were accepted wolf control. Okay, but those are issues that you address on a site-by-site basis. Okay, not with a general recreational harvesting season. You don't punish the entire wolf population for the transgressions of the few. And if I flip over and get into a talk about the scientific support for hunting seasons and the effect that they have, I think there's very little evidence that recreational hunting seasons provide any benefit in terms of depredation reductions. So I think these two positions about their own existing range and no recreational harvest really are the underpinnings of the Ojibwe coexistence relationship with Wayingan. So it's sort of the parallel to that in non-Ojibwe world. Well, if you're familiar at all with the Endangered Species Act, you might have answered this question already. It's very close to the kind of protections that are given to animals that are considered threatened, okay? Now, I'd say that this is actually the status that wolves have had in Minnesota most years since the Endangered Species Act was put in place. Okay, in Wisconsin, wolves have been listed as endangered. In Minnesota, except for the few years that hunting seasons were allowed, they were considered threatened. And the big difference there is that lethal depredation control has been going on in Minnesota forever. At least for, as the wolf population came back, it's gone on. There have been years, there's well over 200 wolves that are killed in depredation control in that state. Yet the population rose up and eventually reached its carrying capacity. Now, you might say, is the big difference here, though, between the European description here and the Ojibwe worldview is that under the Ojibwe worldview, those kind of protections would stay in place even when wolves have sort of filled every bit of suitable wolf habitat in the country. You might say, you know, who would accept that for wolves? And certainly, some people won't. You know, some people never will. Some people will never accept the existence of Ojibwe treaty rights. Some people will never accept the fact that the world is a sphere. But despite that, there is actually an example in another species where this is basically applies. Right? When bald eagles were taken off the endangered species list, they were protected by new legislation, the Bald Eagle and Golden Eagle Protection Act, which essentially kept those kinds of protections in place after delisting. Okay? So there is precedence, I think, and it's, again, based really on cultural understandings. Now, I kind of hate to end with a couple of data slides. I've really tried to avoid that up to here, but I do want to share some important data about attitudes towards wolves. And I think this is really well borne out by some attitude surveys. There's one done in Wisconsin in 2022. There's one done in Minnesota in 2020, where they looked at the public's attitudes towards wolves. Okay? In Wisconsin, within wolf range, amongst people with an opinion, 63% wanted as many or more wolves than existed in the state. 67% wanted as much or more wolf range. If you look statewide, 79% wanted as many wolves as existed in the state. 80% as much wolf range. You've been watching politics at all, you know, you'll never see this on election night, these kinds of figures, right? This is an amazing, overwhelming support, really, for a healthy and robust wolf population. On the question of hunting, in Wisconsin, 46% of the respondents statewide supported hunting, 29% were opposed, and a rather large chunk, 25%, were neutral. I want to compare that with Minnesota. I'll remind you of a few differences again here. Minnesota has a different legal standing for many years, okay, than Wisconsin had. They have almost 3 times as many wolves as the state of Wisconsin has, and wolves were never eliminated in Minnesota. So people have been living and sharing that landscape for a longer period of time than we have here. The Minnesota survey only looked at statewide figures. Well, that's not totally true, but they didn't break it down by wolf zone and non-wolf zone. Statewide in Minnesota, with 2,900 wolves, 86% of the population wanted as many or more wolves in the state. 89% wanted similar wolf range. Only 41% supported wolf hunting. 49% were opposed. Only 10% were neutral. And when it came to trapping, the support was even less. So that's really kind of the bottom line, I think. It shows that we're coming to learn to live with wolves again. And I think that the example of coexistence that was right here on this landscape when my ancestors arrived can help show us how to get there. And with that, I would say thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Question. I'm looking at the map on one of the early slides. It shows 1,000 wolves in Wisconsin, 2,900 in Minnesota. and the area of wolf range looks to be similar in size.
Yeah, that particular figure, and if I jump back to it really fast, that really wasn't quite, that original figure was not wolf range. It was this figure.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, this was, these lines, it is pretty much range in Minnesota, but in Wisconsin it had more to do with a particular research study that looked at habitat suitability in that area.
Yeah.
So much of that area in Wisconsin is not suitable habitat. Similarly, like there is suitable wolf habitat in the lower peninsula of Michigan that doesn't show up. But,
So would you say then that there's 3 times more space for wolves in Minnesota than Wisconsin?
That's a good question. There is substantially more wolf habitat there.
Okay.
That being said, one of the questions, I'll just say, one of the things we always hear is, oh, DNR doesn't know how to count wolves. There's way more wolves than that. And if there are way more wolves than that, it wouldn't align with any research done anywhere in the world. And actually, one of the strongest, I'm pretty careful in my fine-tooth comb application of the state's methodology at counting wolves. I'm pretty damn comfortable with it. And the fact that these populations actually are at this level relative to each other makes sense. If Wisconsin had 3,000 wolves, similar to Minnesota, that just doesn't sort of jive with the habitat. So.
Oh, okay. So it largely habitat. Cool.
Yeah.
Wolf reproduction. Can you address that?
Reproduction?
Yes.
The February is typically the mating period. It's about a 2-month before the pups are born. Typical number of pups might be 4 or 5 on average. And in Wisconsin, wolf packs tend to be pretty small, typically only about 4 or 5 animals. So, but one really important thing about reproduction kind of goes back to the last hunt that we had here. In Wisconsin, if you're not familiar with it, there are 3 years that we had wolf harvest seasons, 2012 to 2014. And then there's this 2021 season. The 2021 season is very different from the 3 previous ones in that it started late. It went into that breeding season. Okay? Those 3 earlier years, most of the season was totally done by December, which actually gave wolf packs an opportunity to sort of recover. If you lost your mate, you might find another one by the breeding season. That really didn't happen in the February season because that happened so late. And I will say, I was privy to a small number of carcasses from that hunt that took place. And we found fetuses in some of the adult females that were harvested. That wouldn't have been the case in those earlier seasons. And so the impact, the impact of that last season was much greater and longer lasting than those previous seasons was. And I hope that answered most of your
Somewhat. But do wolves search out their own reproduction rate? If there are more killed, then they make up for it, or they don't make up for it, or?
So wolves are very good at limiting their own numbers. Okay. There's some question about, are wolves really doing it themselves, or is it a response to prey availability? But the bottom line is, wolf numbers, they have plateaued in Minnesota and Michigan. They're probably about to do that in Wisconsin. And they're just not going to get any higher. And part of the reason is actually in places like Yellowstone, where human mortality is very low, wolf-on-wolf mortality is often the highest cause of death. Okay, so they will limit their numbers that way. Again, though, when a wolf moves into a new area that's unoccupied, they may have some high reproductive rates. Okay, it's not really even quite that simple. Usually, very early after recovery, it's a real struggle. But there's an S-shaped population curve, and you're at the midpoint of that curve, the population can grow quite fast. Now when you're back up near carrying capacity, population growth tapers off again. There's just not a lot of spare places. And you're not going to really get a higher density of wolves on the landscape than probably already exists unless somehow the prey availability increases a lot.
I was wondering, you talked about the Ojibwe's feeling on the wolves. What is Lakota's feeling on the wolves?
You know, I will not answer that question. I don't feel well qualified to answer it, actually. I will say in Wisconsin, amongst the other tribes, in Wisconsin, Menominee, Ho-Chunk, Forest County, Potawatomi, there's a tremendous similarity with the Ojibwe worldview. Some of the histories and the stories are different, but the sort of the application of it becomes very similar.
Is coexistence possible with the hunting season, in your opinion?
Yeah, so that's everybody heard that. You know, could you coexist with wolves and hunt them? That sounds like a pretty straightforward question, but I think it's actually pretty complicated. And it depends partly on your definition of coexistence, and it also depends on whether you're really asking a biological question or an ethical question. Okay, so from a biological perspective, yes, you could have a limited hunt, and as long as you regulate it adequately, you could have a hunt and still have a robust wolf population on the landscape. That doesn't mean that hunting doesn't affect wolf populations or wolf packs, but those two things are not impossible to join together. Okay? But part of it comes to your definition of coexistence. People kill each other all the time. We're quite good at that. We've been doing it for a long time, and yet there's still a lot of people on the landscape. So if you consider that coexistence, you know, and I would say, you know, if you put that question into maybe an Ojibwe perspective, it's like saying, you know, couldn't you hunt your relatives and coexist with them too? And that shifts it very much into an ethical question. And again, and I would also say, you know, bald eagles. You could have a bald eagle season, right? People cringe typically when they hear about bald eagle poaching taking place because it becomes an ethical question. And, you know, is there a legitimate reason to hunt wolves? You know, there's a lot of reasons that are given. You know, people have concerns about human safety, about livestock, about deer impacts. When you look at each of those issues really scientifically, they don't hold water very well. And so, when people actually do hunt wolves, the motivation usually is one of two things. One is it's an act of vengeance. You know, it's a response to either a real or an imagined negative impact caused by wolves, or it's really a novelty. You know, they want the challenge. I'm a hunter. I like hunting things. You know, never had a chance to do this with the wolf. I want to add it to the list of things I've harvested at some point in my life. I think many people would tell you that those are not sound reasons for taking an animal's life, particularly a very sentient social animal. But that's a personal ethical question.
You didn't excuse me, you didn't touch on the fact that wolves are the keystone.
Yeah. And this, you know, there's a lot of work that's come out of Yellowstone, and some of it fairly controversial in terms of how big a driver are wolves on the landscape. But it's clear that wolves have a outsized impact, and it's very interesting, I think, to look at deer as an example. And you know, there's so much concern in Wisconsin right now about chronic wasting disease. Do we know if wolves can limit chronic wasting disease or not? It's a very hard question to ask because there's very little overlap actually between wolf range and the areas with the highest chronic wasting disease presence. But everything that we sort of know ecologically about wolves suggests that they probably do. They can detect CWD, we know that, and they can probably detect it far earlier than a human can. Okay? And so if a wolf can find that animal and take it out of the population early on, there's modeling work and that kind of stuff that suggests that wolves probably have a big impact. Probably bigger even than like cougars because of the way they hunt. Cougars are ambush hunters, you know, so they tend to wait and take what comes along, whereas wolves pursue prey and find the weakest one and concentrate on that animal. All of the work that was done with human hunters to try to have an impact on the deer herd really isn't very successful. But with wolves, they're out there 24/7, 365 days a year. And so they're very different in terms of their effect on the deer herd than a human hunter is. And of course, they're interested in the weak and the feeble and the ill as easier prey. Pretty much the opposite animals that most sport hunters are most interested in given the opportunity.
Do they detect the CWD by smell?
Yeah.
Is that right?
And there's some other diseases they probably detect. On Iowa Oil has been worked on with. I think there's a gum disease even that they can tell and concentrate on those animals. I mean, their sense of smell is so unbelievably good. It's astounding what they can probably do. But you see this also being done with dogs and things now, to detect all these different, from bombs to drugs to endangered species to diseases. That's certainly, yeah, that's a great benefit to have if you're a wolf, to have that as part of your ecological tool bag. Well, the thing I didn't think was all of you, and I really appreciate all of you coming out on this beautiful Northwoods day or night. It's hard to tell lately what's day and night here.